Going to our third question from Rosaline, she's looking for advice on structuring their introduction chapter. What is the best format for an introduction chapter for a PhD thesis in monograph form? Now, Matthew, if you can first let us know what's a monograph and how does that differ from something else? And then secondly, any advice you can provide on structuring that. And I have a sneaking suspicion you're going to mention the template guidelines from the university as well.
You know me well, David. So I'm definitely going to start there. We always go to our guidelines from the university first. But if you don't have those guidelines, here's some things to think about. First, what is a monograph dissertation? So monograph dissertation is when we have one complete study in our dissertation. It's what a lot of people think about as more of a traditional dissertation, where it's one study, 5 chapters, and we move through the dissertation process. This is different than some universities. There's a couple of different models of dissertations. So there's action research dissertations where you are implementing changes and then you're monitoring those over cycles and writing about that change cyclically over time. There's also portfolio style dissertations. They have different names, but basically you would publish papers and then those papers would be woven together. There might be an introduction chapter and a conclusion chapter to kind of bookmark it. That it would be more of a portfolio of published work. But we're talking today about really that 5-chapter dissertation, that sort of standardized structure. In your chapter 1, this is your introduction chapter. And this is where you're going to really just lay out all the key ideas for your reader and your committee. So we start with a simple introduction. We give a little bit of background, not a lot of detail here, but we do include some citations. We're including some literature, just enough to help the reader understand where we're going. We're going to state our problem in and out really quick, 1 to 2 paragraphs, very direct. The problem this dissertation seeks to solve is, and we're going to fill in the blank. The same thing for a purpose. We're going to do a 1 or 2 paragraph purpose statement. We're going to state our research questions and our hypotheses if we're doing that quantitative work and we have null hypotheses we have to address. We're going to identify the theories and the conceptual frameworks. We're going to write about those here and help the reader understand what theories we're borrowing from, what frameworks we're leaning on as we design the rest of our study. And then the most important part, we're going to explain why this study matters. We're going to include a significance section. This is why this study matters. This is the gap that it fills in. And this is how we hope to move the field forward. You might also include a definition section in your chapter 1. Some universities require that, some discourage that. So there's a little flux there in my experience. And then, of course, just a simple conclusion on the way out. This is what we talked about in this chapter. Remember that dissertation writing is its own genre. And so you're going to break a lot of rules from other writing genres that you've learned. We're going to repeat ourselves a lot. We're going to forecast a lot. And so you want to always make sure you have that strong conclusion that wraps everything up and forecasts your chapter 2.
I think the other thing that's sometimes added, and again, this is something that differs between institutions, is right at the end is a sort of outline of the chapters that follow, a paragraph that just says the literature review will follow and will cover the following aspects and move through each of your chapters. But again, that does differ between institutions. So if you ever find yourself uncertain, a really good rule of thumb is to look at previous dissertations that have been published in the form you're doing, whether that's a monograph or manuscript by publications. And there you want to check what are the specific norms for your department, because again, that differs substantially. Myself, for instance, I did a PhD by publication. So I had different chapters and then had this very interesting introduction and discussion that had to pull together 3 or 4 different experimental studies. So it really does differ. So always checking those guidelines is super important. And if your university isn't the kind that's giving you great guidelines, take a look at those previous examples as well. But to dig a little bit deeper, Matthew, you mentioned a few sections in the introduction, and I think one that's really important is the significance section. Can you give any advice on what are the specific things that we should be covering in there other than saying, this is the literature gap? Because I know a lot of students suffer with that section, feeling like they don't know what to put in.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think of all the sections in chapter one, this is the section that is the most abstract.
Mm.
And also, I think the section that has the widest gap in university expectations. So the
Mm.
difference from university to university. So, some general rules. First, we are going to start that section with the gap. We're going to say very clearly the gap in the literature is blank. And here's how I came about that. You're going to kind of forecast what's going to be in your chapter two. You're going to talk about this in detail in your chapter two. And so this is where it gets tricky because a lot of people feel like they've written too much or too little in this section, knowing that that chapter two is coming. So I generally say 1 to 2 paragraphs about your gap is where you should start until your advisor tells you otherwise. Then we pivot from the gap into being able to say, here's how I'm filling the gap. And that is really the significance, right? So the significance of your paper is how you fill the gap in the literature in order to move your industry, in order to push your sector forward. So once you identify the gap, you're going to say, here's how I fill it. And you're going to mention all the ways that you fill it. You might fill the gap by your population and sample. You might fill it by your methodology. You might fill it by your sample size. You might fill it by your paradigm. Maybe you have, maybe it has only been studied through case studies and observation, and you're really doing the first experiment. That would be a way to fill the gap. And so you're talking about how your study fills the gap in as much detail as you can, and then how filling that gap will improve the industry. So that's sort of the third part. So we've identified the gap. We talk about how we're filling the gap, and then how or why does filling the gap move everyone forward? Why is that good for everyone that we fill the gap? So that's 3 to 5 paragraphs, I would say, for that section. Really, 1 paragraph for each of those 3 components is probably sufficient until your advisor tells you otherwise.
I think that's great advice, especially the idea of keeping it short and focused and to the point. I think that's probably a risk that many students find themselves in, is that they over explain in the introduction and then they get worried in the literature review.